Good morning and happy Sabbath to all of you. Welcome to Highland View Academy Alumni Weekend. We're glad that you've come to Sabbath school this morning. And so I wanted to welcome you. I am Monty Benton, a graduate of the class of 1996. And this morning, we're going to have a pretty simple program for you. We're going to have a special music by Mark DePinto. He was one class ahead of me, class of 95. This is also his honor year since the pandemic caused us to cancel Alumni Weekend last year. And Mark is on the faculty at Washington Adventist University. And I know when we were students here, we all really enjoyed listening to his performances. I think of the trip that we made to Russia in 1994 and Moldova. And Mark played on a number of instruments there. And at one point, I think somebody knocked the keyboard cover over onto his hands as he was in the middle of performing maybe the Sunken Cathedral or something else of that nature by WC. So we're really glad that Mark is here. I'll make an apology for the instrument that he's playing on. So we're going to start with special music. Your program says that we were going to do song service, but we decided that's probably not the best plan for this morning. So without further ado, Dr. Mark DePinto. Thank you so much, Mark. As you were playing, I was thinking about the words to that song, as I'm sure the rest of you were too. And I'm speculating that maybe the cleft of the rock is a place that Mark has come to associate with Highland View Academy. Certainly, for all of us who are alumni and have attended here, we have looked over there at Black Rock from this campus throughout that entire time. And today, I'm going to be speaking with you some about some things that I've learned about this area recently. I must say, as I look out at those of you who are assembled here, I am a little bit intimidated because I think that I see Mrs. and Mr. Carr in the back row there. And when I think of my knowledge of the history of Mount Etna and compare it to Mrs. Carr and Mr. Carr, I'm humbled by that. And so let's start with a word of prayer. Bow your heads with me. Dear Jesus, we come to you this morning after a tumultuous year, and we are grateful, we're thankful that we see your hand even in troubled, turbulent times. This morning, I think about the words that you spoke to us when you were starting your ministry in the Sermon on the Mount. Those were challenging words at the time for those that heard them then. They are to us now as well. It was here at Highland View Academy in the Bible class here that I remember that we studied that chapter thoroughly, and it opened my eyes to the upside-down kingdom that you were talking about, a kingdom in which the poor in spirit and others that were lowly would, in your kingdom, come to be exalted. This morning we're going to be talking about some really hard truths about the history of this place that we all love so much. And I ask that you will come into our hearts and help us with this process of understanding, help us with this process of forgiveness, this process of restitution. Help this today to be the beginning of a discussion that leads more people to a clearer understanding of your love for those that are poor, those that are oppressed, those that are the lowly. We ask this in your name. Amen. If you can see the slide that's displayed on the screen there, today I'm going to be talking about the history of Mount Etna. And when I say Mount Etna, maybe the most concise way to really describe that is by looking at that picture. I work at a company called Manitowoc that owns the Grove Company, and I design cranes for them, mobile cranes. And I work just north of the Mason-Dixon line from here in Pennsylvania, in a little tiny town called Shady Grove. Closest thing to us is Greencastle, if you are familiar with the area. When I leave my office every day, which really isn't an office, it's a cubicle, but when I leave there and get in my car to drive home, I come onto a ridge almost immediately in the middle of the valley, and that's what I see. I took that picture in our last snowstorm, and for those of you who can't see it well, it is the mountain range that you can see from Highland View Academy. Black rock is visible with snow on the rocks. And there's the mountain pretty much from Smithsburg to Boonesboro it's possible to see in that picture. That is also nearly coincident with one of the original land patents that was given in colonial Maryland called the Mount Etna Tract. Later, it became known as the Long Mount Etna Tract. It survived all the way with very few pieces of it being sold off from before the Revolutionary War until just before the Civil War. Lonnie, if you can move to the next slide. So I do want to get right to the point that I'm trying to make, and then I'm going to give the supporting evidence for that. But what I've learned about the history of this area is actually quite startling. And maybe that's just for me because I grew up here in Mount Etna. The home that I grew up in is right across from the Mount Etna School. It's one of the properties that was first sold and subdivided when this property was acquired by Adventists. Maybe it will be startling to you, I don't know. Some of you have really deep connections to this area as well. But I started with words that echo Abraham Lincoln on that slide. So it's been 12 years since the furnace at Mount Etna began to blast to create the cannons that were apparently hugely significant in the winning of the Revolutionary War. Now, for those of you who have been here and grew up like me as an Adventist in this community, this was maybe not so clear. There were documents in the paper that ran in the 1950s that indicated that when Mr. Schaefer found the cannons, he's an Adventist man who lived near the traffic circle, when he found those cannons in his garden, as I understand it, they were defective, the ones that were there. And there were records that indicated that the first batch of cannons had been defective, which is true, and that the man testing them had been killed. However, what I think was lost to many of us who had at least known that part of the story is that weeks later, the forge and the furnace produced cannons that were highly effective. And that all of this occurred prior to the Declaration of Independence, such that 1 week after the Declaration of Independence was signed, the furnace here had supplied 1,000 tons of cannons toward the war. This was only the first order, and it continued for years. These cannons were used to fortify the entire Chesapeake Bay region, Alexandria. Some of the last orders for cannons were hugely significant in the final battle at Yorktown. I'm sorry that this moves me to tears, I really am. It's because of the other side of this story. It's who made these cannons. So, I have another quote there. It's from Winston Churchill. It was what he said of the RAF, right, the Air Force that defended Great Britain. A quote about the pilots who had given their lives in order to prevent Hitler from taking England. And that quote, I'm sure you're familiar with it, that never so, have the quote is there, it's sort of escaping me, but anyhow, about so few, or so never have so many. Lonnie, can you read it for me?
Never has so much been owed by so many, so few.
So it talks about just how, and I think we as Americans, and those of us here at Mount Etna, have a real obligation to tell the story of another group of people who made enormous sacrifice that did not benefit them in any way. So let's go to the next slide. I apologize, I can't see them, so I need to quickly familiarize myself with where I'm headed here. Yeah, so this is a picture of the excavation that was done of the forge, the furnace behind the fire station here in Mount Etna. This is a really important archaeological site. It's connected to what was happening prior to the revolution, and it was intact up until the late 1970s, when expansion of the fire station caused them to run into it, and then it was excavated and studied quite thoroughly. Let's move to the next slide. This is the connection that I've come to in the last year that I wanted to share with you. So when studying African American people prior to the Civil War, it is very, very difficult. It's very difficult to do because their names are not recorded in the census records, where 3/5 of their existence was counted toward the voting power. Their names were not recorded. And so the map that was made during the Reconstruction period in Washington County just after the Civil War is the first time where we're able to really see names. And so there's a map of Washington County, and it was divided into districts. And where we're standing now was District 16, called Beaver Creek. I think that's why our fire station is called Company 16, though I don't know that to be sure. And then to the north of us, also on the Mount Etna tract, was a little piece of the Chewsville district. So I would like to move to the next slide, which is a close-up image of the Chewsville district. This includes Pondsville. It's an area that I know was important for Adventists in the early period of our existence here. And what was really startling to me was to learn that in 1877, there was a black church in Pondsville. It was an AME church, and there is a burial ground that survives, that is still there, and there are records that we'll come to next that show the names of those who were buried there. So when we get to that, I'll talk about that more. Moving to the next slide, this is Beaver Creek District. So it includes the area where we're standing, where the Mount Etna School is, down to Black Rock. In 1877, there was another black church in Bagtown, which is right underneath Black Rock, and there was a school. So I'd just like you to take a moment to consider the population of Bagtown is 1% not white today. The population of Mount Etna is 1% not white. The population of Jugtown is 1% not white in the 2010 census. But in 1877, as I have thumbed through those records, it appears that possibly 1/3 of the population of this area was African American. And there was a school, and there were 2 churches. If we move to the next slide, it brings us all the way to today. This is a very high-resolution scan made by a technology called LiDAR that gives elevation accuracy within about a few inches. And what I learned by looking at this is that the Bagtown Church and the AME Church and both of the communities that were close to them are also very close to the largest ore mining operations that were part of making those cannons. I believe this to be new information that others have not connected in the past. It shows a connection, but I must stress that correlation is not causation. The challenge that's before us is to try to truly connect the names of the people that were part of those communities that were exposed in the records that were made after the Civil War with their parents and their grandparents, and maybe their great-grandparents, who were the ones who toiled on this mountain creating those cannons. As of yet, I do not have any direct link between those communities and those that were enslaved making the cannons. Lonnie, if you move to the next slide. So I did those from north to south. So the next slide is one that actually shows Mount Etna School. It shows some of the ore pits that are there. And I'd just like to tell you, those of you that are familiar with this area, you know the big slide at Mount Etna, right? It's kind of a landmark that's been there for a long time. If you're at the top of the big slide, you're actually standing on a trail that was made by dragging the materials to the furnace. And if you go about 50 feet into the woods, you come to a charcoal hearth. It's a flat area on the ground, about 10 meters in diameter, 35 feet in diameter. It is a place where likely an African person worked to chop trees, put them into a huge pile, cover them with materials so that they would not fully burn, and then tend them for a period of several weeks as that was turned into charcoal, which was the fuel that powered the furnaces. An entire acre of forest was necessary every day at the forge in order to provide it with enough fuel to do this operation. Those people worked on the mountain for a century. They cut all of the trees on the mountain that you see if you go out and look toward the east at least 2 times, maybe 3 times. Those charcoal hearths, I've counted hundreds of them on the land that we as Adventists have kind of considered to be ours, though most of it is state forest or owned by others. And it's truly remarkable when you look at these scans that are just from actually a month ago, still show the trails that connect all of these and these features. If you're interested in walking up there to look at those, the one that's right behind the slide is certainly the most accessible. There is an ore pit also just up the trail from there that's a pretty comfortable walk. So moving on, the records that do exist that expose a few of the names of those who were enslaved in this industry are in a few categories. One of them is in kind of like an advertisement that was run when somebody would run away in order to try to give information for using to apprehend them. The first example of a runaway that I have found that's connected with this operation is shown on the screen there. I believe the name is Harold Butler, though my screen is too small to read that. This is from the 1790s. It should be pointed out that newspapers did not exist in Hagerstown very much ahead of this date. So as soon as papers are printed, we see that there were people running away from the forge and from the furnace. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm doing these out of order, which is probably confusing. Yeah, okay. So Crystal Falls AME, there is a list of those that are buried in the cemetery. There is a little bit of information on record at the Western Maryland room of the library about this church, but it's quite a small amount of information. It all fits on one typewritten page. The haunting thing about the description of the Crystal Falls Cemetery is that he describes that there are a lot of stones with no names. The excavations of similar sites at Catoctin are really eye-opening in this area. I'm sorry. We just don't know. When excavations have been done of similar sites, many, many more graves have been discovered. Earlier graves that contain artifacts that point to these being first-generation Africans, possibly brought here from regions of Africa where they were sought after because they had a superior understanding of how to make iron and steel. The fact that Mount Etna furnace was the most successful furnace in this area highly suggests the technology from these people made this possible. One of the names on the stones that is still readable is Martha Fowler. It says on her stone that she is the wife of Charles Fowler. If you move to the next slide, you can see him recorded with his family in the census of 1870. He is also recorded at a white person's farm that is just off the property where Lonnie Bird grew up, who's showing us the slides. It was a property that was purchased by Adventists in a plan to move the Washington Adventist University out of Tacoma Park, Maryland, which had possibly become too diverse for our tastes. That did not happen, thankfully, but the connection between those things is something that weighs heavily on my heart. Moving to the next slide, the names that are recorded in Bagtown also include the note about many other stones unmarked. One name I've been able to trace here is Hezekiah. Hezekiah, his stone, I believe he died in 1871, according to the record there. He was recorded in the 1870. He was living with an 89-year-old man who was listed as a day laborer. It's also recorded sorry. Moving on, there's a picture of one of the cannons that was discovered by Adventists in the 1950s in front of the Hager House. The Hager House, of course, is the most important site for Hagerstown historically. You can read the signs that give in quite a lot of detail about the cannon, its discovery, and its production. There is no mention of African Americans. That's terrible. Okay, moving on now, we're to the couple of the most significant clippings that I've found from the pre-Civil War time frame. I had already set this one up about the runaway who was recorded in the earliest papers, and he is connected directly to this. Moving to the next one, it's a slightly different case. This shows that in Washington County, the enslaved or even the free blacks always had hanging over them that their family members could be sold at any time. This confirms that this happened here as a part of the Mount Etna operation. It describes a young woman and her son being available for sale. The prices for selling African Americans continued to increase during the antebellum period. In the case of Reverend Henry, who wrote an autobiography that you probably should read, it shows that most all of the income that he made as a free black man after he was freed, actually started in the iron industry, and then he gained his freedom. Most of the money that he earned went to purchasing his wife and his children. When it was found out that his name was in the papers of John Brown, he had to flee, and he was not able to purchase his last two children. My final slide is another that I think is a real cautionary tale. In 1861, the Boonesboro Oddfellow newspaper ran an article that describes that a black man who had enlisted in a Connecticut regiment was supposedly recognized by someone who knew the owner of the Mount Etna furnace, and that he was taken from his unit and returned to his master. It's worth noting that the editorial tone of this piece is used for basically propaganda in order to try to establish that in fact that slavery has nothing to do with why the Civil War is occurring. It's pretty startling because that's 1861. You know, that's like right as it's happening, and it's happening right here. I don't know his name. I have looked up his master's name, and I've listed the ages of the males that were in his listing in 1850. If it is true that this man really was an employee of the furnace, then probably that is one of those people. It might not be true. either. If it is true, it suggests that there's a connection between someone who lived in Mount Etna and was in Boonesboro in the position to have done this to this enlisted black man. So there it is. I didn't expect to cry while delivering that. I don't know what you want to do with that information. I see this as the beginning of a conversation that we should have about what we, the people that now occupy this land, what we can do to try to connect more of this history, to understand it better, and to help those that are in search of their past to possibly be able to connect here with things as relevant as knowing that this small group of enslaved Africans had a huge part in our winning of the Revolutionary War. So I thank you all for listening to me today. Like I said, I really would like to begin a conversation. The cemetery at the old AME church is in very, very poor condition. Parts of that history are being lost right now, and I'm hopeful that we will find some partners that can do something about that. Thank you very much.